This episode hosted Ben Shapiro, who covered a wide range of current political and social topics. The discussion began with a deep dive into a massive welfare fraud scandal within the Somali American community in Minneapolis, touching on issues of mass migration, government accountability, and political complicity. The episode also touched on the controversial arrest of the January 6th pipe bomber, scrutiny around military actions in the Caribbean, ongoing economic concerns under the Biden and Trump administrations, significant media and entertainment industry developments, and legal decisions affecting Texas redistricting. The conversation started by examining the unfolding welfare fraud scandal implicating over 86 individuals in Minnesota, predominantly from the Somali American community. The fraud centered on bogus Medicaid claims for services such as school meals, therapy for autistic children, and housing for recovering addicts. One notorious example included a scheme where sham companies submitted fake invoices and attendance rosters for non-existent meals, even using randomly generated names online. This scandal reportedly cost taxpayers upwards of $1 billion, which starkly contrasts with claims from local media touting only $67 million in Somali community tax contributions. The level of fraud, particularly involving relatives and community members conspired to exploit the system, highlighted the dangers of an expansive and poorly monitored welfare state. The issues raised by this welfare fraud scandal intersected with broader discussions about mass migration policies. The Somali American population in Minnesota grew from 200 in 1990 to nearly 200,000 today, largely due to humanitarian-focused migration policies dating back to the early 1990s. While some media narratives painted Somali immigrants as economic contributors and success stories, the episode argued that socioeconomic indicators, such as poverty and educational attainment, remain poor in this group, and the fraud scandal undermines claims of broad benefit from mass migration. Furthermore, recent policy shifts by the Trump administration to limit the duration of work permits for asylum seekers were framed as efforts to increase accountability and border security, especially in light of violent incidents involving immigrants, such as the killing of 2 National Guard members by an Afghan national in Washington, D.C. Ben Shapiro focused considerable attention on Representative Ilhan Omar's connections to the welfare fraud scandal in her Minnesota congressional district. Omar is accused of having close ties to major fraud figures, including relationships with owners of fraudulent businesses and the conviction of one of her own staffers for multi-million-dollar thefts related to these schemes. Omar was said to have hosted parties at a restaurant co-owned by a convicted fraudster who illegally profited millions while spending lavishly. Despite evidence to her awareness of these activities, Omar has publicly denied any knowledge, labeling accusations as racist attacks. This denial was critiqued as implausible, given her documented interactions with key figures involved. The episode also highlighted Omar's broader controversial political positions, such as her criticism of President Trump's migration stance, previous letters supporting leniency for an ISIS recruit, and accusations that her rhetoric feeds divisiveness. Omar's response to the welfare fraud allegations was framed as victimhood, including an op-ed in the New York Times where she claimed Trump's criticisms amounted to hateful rhetoric, leading to death threats against her and her community. Organizations like KIR's Minnesota director also framed Somali Americans as the true victims of the scandal, asserting that the fraud disproportionately impacted vulnerable families within the community, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota found himself under scrutiny for overseeing the environment in which this fraud occurred. Walz reportedly expressed being personally victimized by some of the public backlash, focusing attention on being insulted rather than addressing the systemic failures that allowed widespread fraud to persist over years. Comments about racial slurs being directed at him were discussed, but framed as small relative concerns compared to the massive fiscal damage and social disarray accompanying the scandal. Other Minnesota political figures, such as State Senator Zob Mohammed, defended the Somali community as integral to the state's success, despite historical evidence that Minnesota prospered before the migration influx. These political defenses underscored the tension between race, immigration, and policy accountability. Switching topics, the episode covered the arrest of Brian Cole Jr., accused of planting pipe bombs outside both the RNC and DNC during the January 6th Capitol riot. Though the events occurred over 4 years prior, the arrest was credited to diligent investigative work during the Trump administration that had languished under the Biden administration. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated that no new tips or witnesses triggered the arrest, but rather focused prosecutorial effort. The politics and motivations of the bomber remain unclear. Democrats attempted to politicize the timing and significance of the arrest, with Senator Mark Warner lamenting resource diversions from other law enforcement priorities. The episode criticized these partisan spins, emphasizing the importance of recognizing successful law enforcement actions irrespective of political context. The discussion also mentioned a media misidentification incident involving a woman mistakenly linked to the bombing due to an intelligence memo leak. The episode addressed recent criticism from Democrats about a September 2nd strike ordered by Navy Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley against drug-running boats in the Caribbean. Controversy arose over a so-called double-tap strike where 2 survivors of the initial missile attack were killed in a follow-up strike while allegedly trying to continue their mission. Democrats condemned this as unlawful killing of shipwrecked individuals. Defense officials and Senator Tom Cotton countered that the 2 men remained combatants, actively salvaging narcotics and communicating with traffickers, thus justifying the second strike under the laws of armed conflict. Investigations found no evidence that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth ordered the second strike, contrary to some media reports, and Democrats pressing the issue seemed to lack supporting witnesses for some allegations. The segment placed this dispute within the historical context of drone warfare and policies shaped under the Obama administration, which routinely employed double-tap strikes on alleged terrorist targets. This bipartisan precedent complicated Democratic critiques and suggested the issue would likely dissipate. Economic concerns featured prominently, particularly the persistent inflation and affordability crisis. Although inflation rates had ostensibly declined under President Trump compared to the spikes during Biden's tenure, many Americans continued to perceive living costs as their worst in memory. Shapiro explained this disconnect by noting that people often expect not just stable prices, but actual deflation, lower prices than before, which is difficult to achieve without recession or dramatic supply increases. Polling showed that nearly half of Americans blamed the current administration, namely Trump's, for their financial difficulties, despite the common economic principle that presidents inherit economic conditions rather than solely control them. Democrats sought to blame Republicans for cost issues, with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer pushing for expanded Obamacare subsidies to address healthcare affordability, despite criticisms of the program's structural inefficiencies and funding challenges. The episode briefly covered Netflix's significant acquisition of Warner Brothers, including HBO Max and major franchises such as DC Comics and Harry Potter. This $72 billion deal was seen as a strategic move by Netflix to secure exclusive content amid growing streaming competition and rising content production costs. The transaction was unlikely to trigger antitrust concerns due to marketplace alternatives for consumers. In media news, CBS News was discussed with reference to former staffers lamenting the network's shift toward opinion-driven content rather than traditional fact-based journalism. Barry Weiss's upcoming interview series on CBS was mentioned as a potential corrective measure. Also reported was a salacious media scandal involving former Vanity Fair journalist Olivia Nuzzi and ex-fiancé Ryan Lizza, who both published conflicting memoirs exposing personal and professional disputes, including ethical breaches tied to Nuzzi's past affairs with political figures. The saga was portrayed as emblematic of contemporary media dysfunction. Lastly, the Supreme Court allowed Texas to use its newly drawn congressional map for upcoming elections, one that was expected to add up to 5 Republican seats and bolster GOP prospects. This decision overturned a lower court's block that had caused confusion and was criticized by the court's liberal justices. The ruling was framed as beneficial to Republicans facing an uphill fight amid a Democratic advantage in polling and projections for the 2024 midterms. Throughout the episode, Shapiro emphasized promotions for Daily Wire membership discounts, Birch Gold investment opportunities, Robinhood's trading platform, Simply Safe home security systems, and ZipRecruiter's hiring services, integrating these sponsors into the conversation.